So I'm an artist working in socially engaged and community-based art right now. Oh, thank you very much. Okay, so that's forward and backward. And a lot of my projects in the recent years have been in partnership with homeless shelter institutions. So that's kind of the framework that I'm coming from. My topic today is not going to be focused on the legalities of copyright, but rather I'm interested in uncovering some of the underlying attitudes that contribute to monopolies of ownership in social relationships, and then the way that this can affect identity. So when we are discussing copyright, some of what we're doing is delineating these boundaries of control and ownership over ideas or images that we've created. And in order to create something, we have to give a personal investment, and this could be an investment of money or time or hard work, or maybe we're investing our intellect, but most importantly, it requires an investment of care. So the act of creation really, it requires nurturing, it requires commitment and attentiveness, all shared qualities with care. So when we also invest our care in an idea, it becomes part of us in a way. It becomes like a child, and this makes sense because I refer to all my art projects as if they're my babies. But when we extend this idea to social relationships, that boundary between care and ownership becomes a little more problematic. But perhaps we can use this to better understand some of the uneven power dynamics that can happen in caretaking relationships. So people need care for all kinds of different reasons, right? Like it could be a disability, it could be an accident or an illness, the aging process, or poverty. Every single person in this room right now is going to be in need of care at some point, at least temporarily. But despite the ubiquity of needing care, we still tend to stigmatize people who need it and blame them for their own circumstances. So even the language that we use to describe these people is, we call them weak or helpless or needy or somehow functioning below a standard. So this language further debilitates people who are in need of care, and it starts to erode their autonomy over time by infantilizing them. So that oftentimes this act of nurturing or caring, it sets up this polarity between powerlessness and the powerful, rather than a mutually autonomous relationship. So I have a couple slides. So I wanted to talk a little bit just about public assistance in the US and how that's structured and how that can also affect identity. So there's about 500,000 people currently homeless in the US, and it's said that about 1.5 million people are using homeless shelters every year. In New York, where I'm from, there's currently 60,000 people who are homeless. So in the US, once someone loses their home and becomes dependent on the state for their survival, they become de facto property of the state. So once you enter the shelter system, your autonomy is slowly stripped away. This happens for all kinds of because of all kinds of different reasons, such as you're subject to security searches, a lot of personal items aren't allowed. It's basically like going through airport security every single day. And your time is very structured, so you have to get up at a certain time, there's a curfew, you have to be back inside, you have to structure your time in accordance to caseworker meetings, even if it conflicts with your work schedule. And also, you could be transferred from shelter to shelter anywhere. In New York, it could be anywhere within the 5 boroughs. So maybe on Monday, your commute to work is 20 minutes, but on Thursday, you have an hour and a half commute to work. So this isn't like, I'm not here to really pass judgment on these shelter policies and rules, but It's just to point out that when you enter a shelter, the movements of your body are no longer self-determined. They are subject to the institution that you're a part of. And perhaps most interestingly to this audience, if you're residing in a shelter and you're doing an interview or you're having your photograph taken, the shelter's consent for your words and images overrides your own personal consent. So we have this saying in the US, it's beggars can't be choosers. I don't know if it translates at all, but this saying really reveals this attitude that the privilege of choice belongs only to people who are economically successful. And I'm really interested in how this reduction of choice can affect identity, especially in a consumerist culture where we place so much emphasis on self-expression based on what you're consuming or buying or purchasing. So we've really created this, it's kind of a double bind. We've created conditions of helplessness, and yet we still require self-sufficiency and independence. So we don't realize maybe that attitudes of helplessness are actually internalized, and autonomy can be eroded from the outside in. So maybe after hearing a little bit about how shelters are structured, you can understand why some people who are homeless might choose to be on the street rather than in a shelter, because they can retain a little bit more autonomy that way. But I would just hasten to say that there's such a dire housing crisis in the US that although someone might be on the street rather than a shelter, no one's choosing to be homeless. Where am I? Okay, so the Sergeant Benevolent Association, they issued a public memo a while back, it was maybe a year ago, asking all New Yorkers to photograph anyone that they saw who were violating quality of life. So they were grouping in homeless people with drug users and other criminals. And these images were then published on a public Flickr site. And it was said that, oh, these images will help us to give help to people who need it, but what that means in reality is really actually pretty ambiguous. So if a photographer and their subject are both in public places, you're allowed to use someone's image without their express consent, usually, in most cases. But that's resting on this idea that you're both choosing to be in that space, and for the unhoused, that just is not the case. And housing really acts as a barrier between public and private life, right? So if you have housing, then those four walls around you act as this extension of your body. There's just this extra barrier between you and the world. But for people who are unhoused, there is no second barrier, and the private body actually becomes a public space. So I just want to close by just maybe asking the question, how can we better protect people? How can we better preserve the self-ownership of people who are economically disadvantaged? In his writings on ethics of care for the self, Foucault says that an ethical relationship to power is one in which a viewer gains agency to interpret the world around him or her without didactic demands or commercial restraints. So I think that we could take this approach, the ethical approach to care or creation is it's interwoven with freedom and autonomy. So rather than ownership and dominion. So we might say that this relationship between creation and viewing something, or the relationship between caretaker and receiver of care, it can be a mutually empowering relationship. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.